The legend of Ken Rex McElroy, the town that killed a monster. The town of Skidmore, Missouri, was small. The kind of place where everybody knew everybody. A town built on generations of farmers, store owners, and families who stuck together. And for years, they all lived under the reign of terror of one man. Ken Rex McElroy. A man whose name alone was enough to send shivers through the streets. A towering, brutal figure, thick with muscle, sharp eyes like steel, and a presence that made your stomach tighten when he walked into a room. He was the town's nightmare. And on July 10, 1981, in broad daylight, in the middle of Main Street, in front of dozens of people, Ken Rex McElroy was murdered. Shot dead in the middle of town, in full view of men, women, and children. And when the police arrived to investigate, they asked a simple question. Who killed Ken McElroy? And the entire town looked back at them and said, we don't know. No one spoke. No one confessed. No one saw a thing. This is the true story of how an entire town came together to execute a monster, and how they got away with it. The making of a monster. Ken Rex McElroy wasn't born a villain. But something inside him grew twisted and dark. Born in 1934, he was one of 16 children, raised in a poor family, barely educated. He never finished school. Never cared for rules. By the time he was a teenager, he had turned to crime. Small things, at first. Stealing livestock, breaking into barns. But as he grew older, he grew bolder. McElroy became a thief, a bully, a predator. He stole cattle from hard-working farmers and dared them to stop him. If they tried, he'd burn their barns to the ground. He stole from the local grocery store, walking out with an armful of beer, laughing when the owner threatened to call the cops. And worst of all, he hunted people. He would stalk teenage girls, waiting outside their houses, whispering threats through their windows. He took underage girls as wives, using intimidation to force their families into silence. And whenever the law came knocking, he walked free. The law couldn't touch him. McElroy wasn't just dangerous. He was untouchable. Why? Because he knew how to manipulate the system. He hired expensive lawyers from the city. He dragged trials out for years, wore jurors down with threats, and never spent a single night in prison. When someone tried to press charges, he showed up at their house. Sat outside in his truck, shotgun in his lap, staring through the windows. A silent message. Drop the charges. Or else. And people did. The sheriff, the courts, the law, none of them could stop him. And so, the town of Skidmore lived in fear. Until one day, he pushed too far. The final straw. It started with a candy bar. A 70-year-old store owner named Ernest Bo Bowenkamp ran the local grocery store. A kind, gentle man who had never harmed anyone. One day, he caught one of McElroy's kids stealing candy. Instead of making a scene, he simply asked the child to put it back. A reasonable request. But McElroy wasn't reasonable. He saw any slight against his family as a challenge to his power. So, days later, he showed up at the store. He didn't argue. Didn't yell. He raised his shotgun and pulled the trigger. Ernest Bowenkamp was shot in the neck, in cold blood, in broad daylight. By some miracle, he survived. McElroy was arrested. The town breathed a sigh of relief. Finally, justice. Or so they thought. The monster returns. McElroy posted bond and walked free. Within hours, he was back at the bar, drinking, laughing, bragging about what he had done. He promised that next time, he wouldn't miss. And the town realized something chilling. The law had failed them. McElroy would never stop. He would never be locked away. And worse, someone else would be next. Unless, they stopped him themselves. The execution. July 10, 1981. McElroy was drunk that morning, as he often was. He climbed into his pickup truck with his young wife beside him and drove into town. But something was off. The town was too quiet. The usual small gatherings of people were larger today, men standing outside the bar, watching. Women peering through windows. He had no idea that every person on that street had already decided his fate. McElroy and his wife walked into the bar. The crowd grew outside. More and more people gathered, watching. Waiting. Then, McElroy stepped back outside. He climbed into his truck. And that's when it happened. Gunfire exploded. Multiple shots, from multiple directions. His wife screamed. Bullets tore through the glass, through his body, through everything he had built. By the time it was over, McElroy was slumped over the steering wheel, blood dripping onto the dirt. The town stood still. Then, slowly, they walked away. No one saw a thing. When police arrived, they had one simple question. Who killed Ken McElroy? Dozens of people were there. Not a single one spoke. Not a single one claimed to see who pulled the trigger. There were no suspects. No one confessed. No one would ever be charged. Because the town had made its decision. They weren't just covering up a crime. They were protecting their own justice. And so, Ken Rex McElroy's murder remains officially unsolved. The legend lives on. The town of Skidmore never spoke of it again. Some say justice was served. That evil was wiped out in a single moment. Others say it was mob rule. And yet, no one regrets it. To this day, people whisper about that morning. The moment a town stood together and made sure evil never walked their streets again. And if you ever visit Skidmore, they'll tell you the same thing. We don't know what happened that day. But the empty streets tell a different story. The disappearance of the Yuba County Five, the men who walked into the dark. Some disappearances make sense. Some can be explained away by logic, by circumstance. A lost trail, a wrong turn, an unfortunate accident. But some stories refuse to be understood. Some stories sink into the marrow of those who hear them, whispering of something deeper, darker, something that doesn't want to be found. This is the story of 5 men who vanished in the wilderness, and what was left behind. The boys who never came home. February 24, 1978. It was supposed to be a simple trip. 5 men, Bill Sterling, Jack Hewitt, Ted Weiher, Jack Madruga, and Gary Mathias, piled into a turquoise Mercury Montego, laughing, excited. They had been looking forward to this night for weeks. They weren't just friends. They were brothers in spirit, each living with mild intellectual disabilities or mental health struggles. Together, they felt safe, understood. That night, they were headed to a college basketball game, something they loved, something they did often. But they never came home. And by morning, the world had changed. The abandoned car. Days later, a forest ranger spotted something strange, a car sitting alone on a remote, snowy mountain road, miles away from where the boys were supposed to be. The car was in perfect condition. No dents, no damage. The keys were missing, but it wasn't stuck, it could have been driven away at any time. Inside, police found maps neatly folded in the glove box. Half-eaten candy bars. A neatly stacked pile of programs from the basketball game. An empty gas tank. But no sign of the 5 men. Just an open road stretching into the wilderness, and silence. The search begins. For weeks, search teams combed the area. Helicopters, dogs, volunteers, everyone looking for any sign of life. But the mountains were endless. The snow was thick. The cold was merciless. And there was nothing. No footprints leading away from the car. No clothing, no items, no blood. It was as if the 5 men had simply stepped out of the vehicle and disappeared. But then, the thaw came. And with it, the bodies began to surface. The cabin in the woods. 4 months later, as the snow melted, a group of motorcyclists stumbled upon a remote U.S. Forestry Service cabin. Inside, the scene was beyond disturbing. On a cot lay Ted Weiher, his body partially decomposed, frozen in place. His feet were bare. His skin was covered in horrific frostbite. He had lost 100 pounds before dying. His beard had grown out, meaning he had survived for nearly 3 months. Inside the cabin, searchers found even more disturbing details. A locker full of canned food untouched. Wood for a fire never used. Extra blankets never touched. It was as if Ted had slowly starved to death, despite being surrounded by supplies that could have saved him. And yet, he wasn't alone. Around the cabin, they found 3 more bodies, the remains of Bill Sterling, Jack Hewitt, and Jack Madruga. Each of them had died trying to escape. They were scattered in different directions, their frozen remains whispering of a final, desperate attempt to get away from something. But where was Gary Mathias? The 5th man, the only one who had suffered no disabilities or impairments. He was simply gone. And what happened next only made the story darker. The unanswered questions. The deeper investigators looked, the less sense anything made. 1. Why were they on that mountain? They had no reason to be in the wilderness, it was miles away from the basketball game and completely off course. 2. Why had they abandoned a perfectly working car? None of them were familiar with the area. There was no reason to leave the vehicle, yet they had walked into the freezing dark with no supplies. 3. Who or what were they running from? Something terrified them enough to scatter into the wild, but no one knows what. 4. Where is Gary Mathias? His shoes were found inside the cabin, meaning he had been there. But his body was never recovered. To this day, he is still missing. The theories. No one knows what really happened that night. But the theories are endless. Theory 1, the Good Samaritan turned killer. Some believe the men were led there. Maybe they trusted a stranger, someone who offered them a ride, someone who led them deeper into the woods. But when things turned dark, they ran. And one by one, they were hunted. Theory 2, the military experiment. The area where the men vanished was near a military base. Some believe they witnessed something they weren't supposed to see. A weapon test, an experiment, a cover-up. They ran into the woods not out of choice, but out of terror. Theory 3, the supernatural. Some say something else was out there. A presence. A force. A thing that didn't let them leave. The fact that they left behind survival supplies, firewood, blankets, all the things that could have saved them, suggests they weren't thinking clearly. As if something clouded their minds. As if something was watching them. The unsolved truth. 46 years later, the case remains a chilling enigma. 4 men found frozen in terror. 1 still missing. No clear answers. No confessions. No final chapter. Just a road that ends in nothing. A mystery that whispers through the trees. And a question that will never be answered. What happened to the Yuba County 5? And more importantly, what was waiting for them in the dark,